Good morning, St. Bernards. You know, one of my favorite Bible stories of all time has got to be the story of Ruth. It's one of the best stories for me. It's one of my favorite books of the Bible. It just tells a really beautiful story of faithfulness. Faithfulness to family, faithfulness to faith, to God. It's just a really beautiful story. And today I want to focus in on a story within the story of Ruth. The big story of Ruth is obviously about Ruth. But there's a smaller story going on in the book of Ruth about Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi. And it's a really beautiful story that really touches me. Naomi she loses her husband, Elimelech, and then 10 years later she loses her two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And one of those is the husband of Ruth before he dies. And the text says, in Ruth chapter 1, verse 5, it says, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman, that's Naomi, was left without her two sons and her husband. And we might just brush over that little verse, but it's really important because in this world, a woman was almost completely and utterly vulnerable without a husband or sons. And so Naomi would have been left just destitute. I mean, the economic and cultural devastation that this would bring for her is kind of hard to overstate. The consequences of these two deaths upon her life are just catastrophic. And to make matters even worse, Naomi, in her grieving, she tells her two daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth, to go somewhere else. She says, I'm unable to have any more sons, and even if I could, it's not like you could wait for them to grow up and then marry them, so you guys go find yourselves husbands and just good luck to you. And she sends them away, and Orpah, one of her daughter-in-laws, says, okay, and she leaves, and that's what she needed to do, I guess. But Ruth decides to stay with Naomi and shows her faithfulness and her love by staying with her. In her speech to the two daughters, Naomi makes this comment. She says, in chapter 1, verse 13, she says, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me. And so she's very distressed. She's perhaps even a tad depressed. And she feels that the Lord has turned against her. And so she's living in just utter destitution and depression. Her world has collapsed in on itself, and she is experiencing extreme duress. And she's so distressed that at one point later on, she's crying out in the midst of her grief and her pain. And she makes this statement. She says, call me no longer Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? And there's actually a really funny little wordplay going on in Hebrew here, because the name Naomi means pleasant or good or delightful. And so she says, don't call me that. Don't call me pleasant. Don't call me delightful. Call me Mara, which means bitter. Call me bitter, because the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. And so she wants to be called bitter. She says, don't you call me pleasant, you call me bitter. And I imagine some of us have felt that way, given some of the circumstances that happen in our lives rather naturally. We might feel destitute or depressed or distressed or completely at the end of our ropes. In our exasperation, we may cry out in our pain and say, don't you call me pleasant, you call me bitter. We might cry out and say, don't you tell me to look on the bright side, because there is no bright side in this. But what I love about the story is that though Naomi makes this emphatic statement, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, nobody ever calls her Mara. If you read the story of Ruth, none of the other people in her story call her Mara. God never addresses her as Mara. And the author of the book of Ruth never calls her Mara. Nobody calls her Mara. The only time she ever gets called Mara is when she says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. And then the text immediately says, so Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, etc. Nobody in the story calls her Mara. And why do I love that little detail? Why does that detail stick out to me? It's because I believe that we serve a God who just won't let us be as bitter as we would if it were left up to us. Because nobody in this story plays into her desired name change. And even though she of all people certainly had reason to be bitter, but she had a God and a community that refused to let her lowest moment be her defining moment. And if you know the story of Ruth, the rest of the story, there's a lot more to it that I'm not going into, and I'd encourage you to read Ruth on your own. But in the story of Ruth, it's about Ruth getting married to this man Boaz, and there's all these lengthy legal complications about inheriting land and how that plays into taking care of Naomi and Ruth. And I won't go into all those details here, but later on, after Ruth marries finally and she bears a son, the women in the town are like rejoicing with Naomi, and they say to her, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons,